The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Westfield Financial as Elaine Johnson pushed through the heavy glass doors. At 34, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her navy business suit pressed to perfection and her natural hair styled in a neat professional updo. Her leather portfolio contained a meticulously prepared business loan application, the culmination of months of planning. Elaine checked her watch. 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes early for her appointment with the branch manager. Perfect timing, as always. The receptionist smiled politely and asked her to take a seat in the waiting area. "Mr. Whitley will be with you shortly," she said. Elaine nodded and sat down, reviewing her documents one last time. Her financial consulting business had been profitable for 8 years, with steady growth each year. Her credit score was excellent at 793, she had substantial savings, and her business plan was solid. By any objective measure, she was an ideal loan candidate. At 10:15, 20 minutes past her scheduled time, Marcus Whitley finally emerged from his office. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and an expensive suit. He glanced around the waiting area, his eyes briefly passing over Elaine before scanning the room again, as if looking for someone else. "Ms. Johnson?" he finally asked, sounding slightly surprised when Elaine stood up. "Yes, that's me. Good morning, Mr. Whitley." Elaine extended her hand. His handshake was brief and limp. "Follow me," he said curtly, turning without waiting for her response. Inside his office, Marcus sat behind a large mahogany desk. He didn't offer Elaine a seat, but she took one anyway, placing her portfolio on his desk. "So, you want a business loan," he stated flatly, not touching her application. "Yes, I'm looking to expand my financial consulting practice. I've been in business for 8 years, and I need capital to lease a larger office space and hire 2 additional consultants to meet client demand," Elaine explained, opening her portfolio. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Financial consulting? And what makes you qualified for that line of work?" Elaine maintained her professional demeanor despite his condescending tone. "I have an MBA from Howard University, 6 years of experience at Goldman Sachs before starting my own practice, and my client list includes several Fortune 500 companies." "Howard, huh?" Marcus said, finally picking up her application and flipping through it carelessly. "And you're requesting $150,000? "Yes, as detailed in my business plan on page 4, that amount will cover." "That's quite a lot of money," he interrupted, not looking at page 4. "We have very high standards here at Westfield." "I understand," Elaine replied calmly. "You'll see that my business financials and personal credit history exceed your published requirements." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "On paper, perhaps. But there's more to lending decisions than what's on paper. We need to consider risk factors." "What specific risk factors concern you?" Elaine asked. "Experience. Real-world experience," he said, emphasizing real in a way that made Elaine's stomach tighten. "Your neighborhood isn't exactly known for producing financial experts." Elaine took a measured breath. "My office is in downtown Chicago, as noted in the application, and my client list speaks to my expertise." Marcus closed her portfolio without reviewing the rest. "We'll need to verify everything thoroughly. These days, everyone thinks they can get a loan just by asking." The meeting lasted barely 15 minutes. As Elaine left his office, she noticed Marcus immediately taking the call and laughing warmly with whoever was on the line, a stark contrast to his cold demeanor with her. Walking to her car, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but she had followed all the proper procedures. Now, all she could do was wait for the bank's decision. 2 weeks passed painfully slow for Elaine. Every morning, she checked her email and mailbox, hoping for good news from Westfield Financial. Her business plans hung in the balance, and she had already begun preliminary discussions with potential new hires. On Wednesday morning, a white envelope bearing the Westfield Financial logo finally arrived. Elaine opened it at her kitchen table, coffee in hand. Her eyes scanned the letter quickly. "Dear Ms. Johnson, thank you for your recent loan application with Westfield Financial. After careful review of your submission, we regret to inform you that your application has been denied at this time due to insufficient business history and concerns about market viability." Elaine read the letter twice more, confusion spreading across her face. Insufficient business history? After 8 years? Market viability concerns for financial consulting, one of the most stable industries. None of this made sense. She placed the letter down and picked up her phone, dialing Westfield's number. After navigating through the automated system, she finally reached Marcus Whitley's extension. Westfield Financial, Marcus Whitley speaking, his voice sounded cheerful. Hello, Mr. Whitley. This is Elaine Johnson. I just received my loan rejection letter, and I'm calling to understand the specific reasons. There was a pause. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its warmth. Ah, Ms. Johnson, yes, the loan committee reviewed your application and found it didn't meet our requirements. The letter mentions insufficient business history, but your own published guidelines state that businesses must be operational for 3 years. Mine has been established for 8, Elaine said, keeping her voice level. Well, yes, but that's the minimum requirement. For loans of your requested size, we look for more established businesses. Your website specifically states that loans up to $250,000 require 3 years of business history. I requested $150,000. Marcus cleared his throat. There were other factors involved. Like what? Elaine pressed. My credit score is nearly 800. My business shows consistent growth, and I have collateral worth twice the loan amount. Look, Ms. Johnson, his voice took on an edge. Lending decisions are complex. We had concerns about your client retention abilities and the sustainability of your growth. Elaine frowned. None of those concerns were raised during our meeting, and my application included 5-year client retention data showing a 92% retention rate. The committee makes the final decision, he said flatly. If you'd like to reapply in 6 months with more substantial documentation, you're welcome to do so. After hanging up, Elaine sat still for several minutes. Something felt deeply wrong about the whole situation. She pulled out her laptop and began researching Westfield's recent loan approvals using publicly available data from community reinvestment reports. What she found disturbed her. Of the small business loans approved in the last year, only 3% went to black-owned businesses, despite the area having a 27% black population. The patterns were too stark to be coincidental. Later that afternoon, Elaine met with her friend Tasha for lunch. I just don't understand, Elaine said, pushing her salad around with her fork. My application was solid. Tasha looked uncomfortable. You know, my brother had the same experience with Westfield last year. Perfect application, unexplained rejection. Your brother? Jason with the accounting firm? Yes, he ended up getting funded through First Community Bank instead, Tasha added. And guess what? He later heard from a friend who works at Westfield that a white business owner with worse financials got approved the same week he was rejected. Elaine put down her fork. That can't be legal. It's not, Tasha agreed. But it's hard to prove unless someone looks at all their lending data. Elaine's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a message from a recruitment firm she'd spoken with months ago. The subject line read, Opportunity at Regulatory Compliance Partners. She opened it, her eyes widening as she read. Perhaps this rejection was leading her somewhere unexpected. The conference room at Martin & Associates law firm buzzed with quiet conversation. Elaine sat next to her friend Tasha's brother, Jason, who had connected her with his attorney, Patricia Martin. 5 other business owners, 4 black and 1 Latino, sat around the large oak table, each with their own rejected loan applications from Westfield Financial. Thank you all for coming today, Patricia said, standing at the head of the table. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair. I've reviewed everyone's loan applications and rejection letters, and I'm seeing troubling patterns. She clicked a remote, and a screen behind her lit up with charts and graphs. These are the approval rates at Westfield Financial for the past 3 years, broken down by race of the business owner. White applicants have an 87% approval rate. Black applicants? Only 12%. Murmurs filled the room. Elaine leaned forward, studying the numbers. Ms. Johnson, Patricia turned to Elaine, your case is particularly interesting because your qualifications are exceptional. I've helped clients secure loans for 20 years, and your application is one of the strongest I've ever seen. Yet they still rejected me, Elaine said. Exactly. And that's what caught my attention. Patricia clicked to another slide. I obtained these approval records through a contact at the Banking Commission. This shows applications approved on the same day yours was rejected. The screen showed 3 businesses that received loans from Westfield. All had shorter business histories, lower credit scores, and higher debt-to-income ratios than Elaine's firm. All 3 owners are white, Patricia added. One even requested a larger loan amount than you. Jason shook his head. This is exactly what happened with my application last year. We believe this shows a clear pattern of discriminatory lending practices, Patricia said. The question is, do you all want to pursue this legally? It would be a long process. While the others discussed the legal options, Elaine's phone vibrated. It was an email confirming her interview with regulatory compliance partners for tomorrow morning. She'd almost forgotten about it in the shock of the loan rejection. After the meeting, Elaine stayed behind to speak with Patricia privately. I have an interview tomorrow with regulatory compliance partners, she told the attorney. They'd audit financial institutions for regulatory violations. Patricia's eyebrows rose. That's quite a coincidence. They're one of the top firms contracted by the Federal Reserve for bank audits. Do you think I should mention this situation in my interview? Patricia thought for a moment. I wouldn't lead with it, but if the conversation turns to why you're interested in compliance work, it would be honest to share that you've seen firsthand how lending discrimination affects communities. That night, Elaine researched regulatory compliance partners thoroughly. The firm specialized in fair lending audits, examining banks for compliance with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act. Their auditors could review a bank's entire lending history, looking for exactly the kind of discrimination she had experienced. The next morning, Elaine dressed carefully in her best suit and arrived 15 minutes early for her interview. The company's offices were impressive, located on the 30th floor of a downtown high-rise with views of the city skyline. Sandra Patel, the hiring manager, greeted Elaine warmly. Your resume is quite impressive, Ms. Johnson. 8 years running your own financial consulting practice, and before that Goldman Sachs. Thank you, Elaine replied. I'm passionate about financial regulations and ensuring equal access to banking services. What sparked your interest in regulatory compliance specifically? Sandra asked. Elaine took a deep breath. Actually, I recently experienced what I believe was lending discrimination firsthand. It opened my eyes to how important proper oversight is in banking. Sandra leaned forward, genuinely interested. Would you mind sharing more about that experience? As Elaine described her interaction with Westfield Financial, she saw Sandra taking detailed notes. What had begun as a painful rejection was starting to feel like it might lead to something much more significant. Well, Sandra said when Elaine finished, it seems you understand the real-world impact of what we do here better than most candidates I've interviewed. Congratulations, Elaine. Welcome to Regulatory Compliance Partners. Sandra Patel extended her hand across the desk, smiling warmly. It had been just 3 days since Elaine's interview, and the offer had come more quickly than she expected. Elaine shook Sandra's hand firmly. Thank you so much. I'm excited to join the team. We were impressed by your background, but even more by your personal understanding of why our work matters, Sandra explained. Your starting salary will be $145,000 annually, with potential for performance bonuses. Can you start in 2 weeks? Elaine nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. This career change hadn't been in her plans a month ago, but sometimes life took unexpected turns. The next morning, Elaine met with her 3 consulting clients to explain her career transition. She had found them other consultants to work with, making the handover as smooth as possible. While she would miss running her own business, the thought of fighting against discriminatory banking practices gave her new purpose. I'll need to shut down my office space, she told Tasha over coffee later that day. But honestly, it feels good to be moving forward after that loan rejection. Have you heard anything more from Patricia about the potential lawsuit? Tasha asked. Yes, she's still gathering evidence. 4 more business owners have come forward with similar experiences at Westfield, Elaine replied. But I haven't told her about my new job yet. I need to figure out if there's any conflict of interest. 2 weeks later, Elaine walked into the gleaming offices of Regulatory Compliance Partners for her first day. She was assigned to a small office with a view of the city and spent the morning filling out paperwork and setting up her computer. At lunch, Sandra introduced her to the team in the break room. Everyone, this is Elaine Johnson, our newest compliance specialist, Sandra announced. Elaine comes to us with an impressive background in financial consulting and investment banking. A tall man with salt and pepper hair stepped forward. Welcome aboard. I'm Robert Chen, Director of Audit Operations. Sandra mentioned you have personal experience with lending discrimination. Elaine nodded. Yes, unfortunately I do. That's actually one of the main issues we're focusing on this quarter, Robert explained. The Federal Reserve has contracted us to conduct special audits on regional banks with suspicious lending patterns. Over the next few weeks, Elaine threw herself into training. She learned the complex regulations governing fair lending, how to analyze loan data for disparities, and how to conduct thorough interviews with bank staff. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. 1 month into her new role, Elaine was called into Robert's office. He gestured for her to take a seat. Elaine, you've picked up the procedures remarkably fast, he said. I think you're ready to join a field team. Thank you, she replied. I'm eager to get started with actual audits. Good, because we have a big project coming up. Robert handed her a folder. The Fed has flagged 5 banks in the Chicago area for audit based on statistical anomalies in their lending patterns. I want you on the team for this one. Elaine opened the folder and scanned the list of banks. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the third name on the list, Westfield Financial. Is something wrong? Robert asked, noticing her expression. Elaine hesitated, then decided honesty was best. Actually, Westfield Financial is the bank that rejected my business loan application. That's the discrimination incident I mentioned. Robert leaned back in his chair, considering this information. That's quite a coincidence. Normally we might consider that a conflict of interest, but in this case... He paused, thinking. Your first-hand experience could be valuable. You know exactly what to look for. I can assure you I'll remain professional, Elaine said. I believe you will, Robert nodded. Just document your previous interaction in our disclosure forms. The audit starts next month. Your team leader will be Michael Dawson. He's one of our best. As Elaine left Robert's office, a sense of poetic justice washed over her. She hadn't sought revenge against Westfield, but somehow the universe had brought her full circle. The conference room at Regulatory Compliance Partners buzzed with activity as Michael Dawson, a veteran auditor with 20 years of experience, briefed his team on the upcoming Westfield financial audit. We'll be focusing on 3 main areas, Michael explained, pointing to a flowchart on the screen. Loan application processing, approval rates across demographics, and consistency in lending standards. He was a methodical man with a reputation for thoroughness that had earned him respect across the industry. Elaine sat near the back, taking detailed notes. In the months since joining the audit team, she had learned that bank audits were far more complex than she had imagined. The team would examine thousands of loan applications, interview dozens of employees, and analyze years of lending data. Elaine, Michael called out, you'll be leading the loan application review. Your background in financial consulting gives you a good eye for inconsistencies in how applications are evaluated. She nodded, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. This would be her first time leading a section of an audit. I should note, Michael continued, addressing the whole team, that Elaine has disclosed a previous interaction with Westfield as a loan applicant. The company ethics board has reviewed the situation and determined there's no disqualifying conflict of interest. In fact, her experience may provide valuable insight. After the meeting, Elaine approached Michael privately. I want to make sure my previous experience doesn't compromise the audit in any way. I appreciate your concern, Michael replied. But remember, we're not looking to confirm bias. We're objectively analyzing data. If Westfield is treating all applicants fairly, the numbers will show that. The weekend before the audit, Elaine prepared meticulously. She reviewed Westfield's published loan requirements, practiced interview techniques for bank staff, and studied the audit protocols until she could recite them from memory. Monday morning arrived with a gray drizzle falling over Chicago. The audit team of 7 people arrived at Westfield Financial's main branch at precisely 9:00 a.m. They were shown to a large conference room that would serve as their base for the next 2 weeks. At 9:30, the bank executives were called in to meet the audit team. Elaine's stomach tightened as the door opened and 5 people walked in. Among them was Marcus Whitley, looking just as confident and dismissive as he had during her loan application meeting. Michael stood to introduce the team. Good morning, I'm Michael Dawson, Senior Audit Director with Regulatory Compliance Partners. We'll be conducting a comprehensive fair lending audit over the next 2 weeks. He introduced each team member in turn, and this is Elaine Johnson, our specialist in loan application review. She'll be analyzing your approval processes and interviewing loan officers. Marcus glanced at Elaine, showing no sign of recognition. She maintained a professional demeanor, giving nothing away. He clearly didn't remember her. The bank's CEO, a gray-haired man named Richard Powell, spoke up. We welcome the audit and are confident you'll find our practices to be fully compliant with all regulations. After the executives left, the audit team dispersed to their assigned areas. Elaine was given a small office near the loan processing department, where she began setting up her workstation. Just before lunch, she received the first batch of loan files, 50 applications from the past quarter, with all identifying information of applicants redacted to ensure impartial review. Elaine created a systematic checklist to evaluate each application using the same criteria. By late afternoon, a pattern was already emerging. Applications with similar financials were being treated differently, with some receiving multiple follow-ups and flexibility, while others were quickly rejected for minor issues. As she was making notes, there was a knock at her door. Marcus Whitley stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Ms. Johnson, I've been asked to provide you with any additional files you might need, he said, still showing no sign of recognizing her. Thank you, Mr. Whitley, Elaine replied professionally. I believe I have everything I need for today. As he turned to leave, Elaine wondered how long it would take him to remember where he had seen her before. The audit was just beginning, and already the evidence was pointing to troubling patterns at Westfield Financial. 3 days into the audit, Elaine's office was filled with stacks of loan applications. She had reviewed over 200 files, meticulously documenting discrepancies in how they were processed. On her computer screen, a spreadsheet displayed stark patterns. Applications from Black and Latino applicants faced more requests for additional documentation, longer processing times, and higher rejection rates than identical applications from white applicants. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. Michael Dawson entered, closing the door behind him. How's it going? He asked, glancing at her organized chaos of papers. The numbers speak for themselves, Elaine replied, turning her screen so he could see. Look at these 2 applications. Nearly identical financial profiles, but the white applicant was approved within 5 days, while the black applicant was rejected after 3 weeks of additional information requests. Michael nodded grimly. We're seeing similar patterns across all departments. The question now is whether this is systemic or coming from specific individuals. I've been tracking which loan officers handled each application, Elaine said, pulling up another spreadsheet. Marcus Whitley personally reviewed most of the minority applications that were rejected despite meeting requirements. Good work. We'll need to interview him tomorrow, Michael said. Would you be comfortable leading that interview? Elaine hesitated only briefly. Yes, I can handle it professionally. The next morning, Elaine prepared the interview room, arranging her evidence in neat folders. When Marcus Whitley entered, his usual confident stride faltered slightly at seeing her sitting in the interviewer's position. Good morning, Mr. Whitley, Elaine said professionally. Please have a seat. I'd like to discuss some patterns we've observed in loan processing. Marcus sat down stiffly. Of course. Westfield Financial is committed to fair lending practices. Elaine opened the first folder. In the past year, your branch has rejected 78% of loan applications from black-owned businesses, compared to only 13% of white-owned businesses with similar financials. Statistical coincidence? Marcus replied immediately. Each application is judged on its own merits. Is it also coincidence that minority applicants wait an average of 12 days longer for decisions? Elaine asked, sliding another document toward him. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. More complex applications require more time. For 45 minutes, Elaine methodically presented evidence of disparate treatment. Marcus grew increasingly defensive, his answers becoming shorter and less convincing. Finally, Elaine opened the last folder. I'd like to discuss a specific case from 2 months ago. She placed a loan application on the table, her own application, with her name visible. Marcus stared at it, then looked up at Elaine with sudden recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're—" he began, his face paling slightly. "Yes, Mr. Whitley. I was an applicant before becoming an auditor," Elaine said calmly. "My application met or exceeded all of Westfield's stated requirements, yet was rejected for insufficient business history despite 8 years of successful operation." Marcus's demeanor changed completely. "This is a setup. You're biased against me personally." "This audit was scheduled by the Federal Reserve before I joined Regulatory Compliance Partners," Elaine replied evenly. "My previous interaction with Westfield was fully disclosed and reviewed for potential conflicts. I'm simply following the evidence." "I need to speak with my superiors," Marcus said, standing abruptly. "Of course, we'll continue tomorrow." Elaine gathered her papers calmly as Marcus hurried from the room. Later that afternoon, Elaine was reviewing documents when CEO Richard Powell appeared at her door. "Ms. Johnson, may I have a word?" he asked, his expression serious. "Certainly," she replied, setting aside her work. "Mr. Whitley has informed me about your previous loan application," Powell said. "I was unaware of this situation." "It's one case among many showing similar patterns," Elaine replied. Powell nodded slowly. "I've reviewed some of your findings. They are concerning. Would you be willing to meet with our board tomorrow? I think they need to hear this directly." Elaine agreed, and as Powell left, she reflected on how differently this might have gone if she hadn't landed at Regulatory Compliance Partners. Sometimes rejection opened doors to something much more important than a loan. The Westfield Financial boardroom was imposing with its dark wood paneling and oil paintings of past bank presidents, all white men, lining the walls. At 9 a.m. sharp, Elaine and Michael entered to find 12 board members seated around a massive oak table. CEO Richard Powell sat at the head, with Marcus Whitley notably absent. "Thank you for meeting with us today," Powell began. "In light of certain findings during the audit, we felt it imperative to hear directly from your team." Michael nodded to Elaine, giving her the floor. She had prepared all night for this moment, organizing her findings into a clear, factual presentation. As she connected her laptop to the projector, she felt surprisingly calm. "Good morning," Elaine began. "Over the past week, our team has identified concerning patterns in Westfield Financial's lending practices. Today, I'll present the statistical evidence and specific cases that illustrate these patterns." The first slide appeared on screen, a graph showing loan approval rates by race. As you can see, white applicants have an 87% approval rate, while black applicants have only a 12% approval rate, even when controlling for income, credit score, and business history. A murmur passed through the board members. An older woman in a navy suit leaned forward. Could this simply reflect different qualifications among applicants? "A reasonable question," Elaine replied respectfully. "However, when we analyzed applications with identical qualifications, the disparity remains." She clicked to the next slide showing paired applications with matching financials, but different outcomes based on race. For 30 minutes, Elaine methodically presented evidence that could not be explained away by financial factors. The board's expressions grew increasingly troubled. "Now, I'd like to address a specific case that illustrates our findings," Elaine said, reaching the most difficult part of her presentation. 2 months ago, I personally applied for a business loan from this institution." Several board members exchanged surprised glances. "Yes. Before joining Regulatory Compliance Partners, I owned a financial consulting firm for 8 years. My application exceeded all published requirements for approval, yet it was rejected for insufficient business history." Elaine displayed her loan application, then showed 3 others approved the same week, all from white business owners with shorter business histories and lower credit scores. "This is not about my personal experience," she clarified. "My case is just one example of a pattern affecting hundreds of qualified minority applicants." Powell looked grim. "Where does Mr. Whitley factor into this?" "Our analysis shows that 83% of the applications with these unexplained disparities were personally reviewed by Mr. Whitley," Elaine answered. "When interviewed, he was unable to provide consistent explanations for these decisions." A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, the board chairman, a distinguished older gentleman, spoke up. "Ms. Johnson, your presentation is troubling but compelling. What would typically happen following such findings?" Michael stepped in. Regulatory action could range from mandated changes in lending practices to significant fines. In serious cases, criminal charges of discrimination can be filed. The chairman nodded gravely. And if an institution takes immediate corrective action, that would be considered favorably in the final report, Michael replied. Powell cleared his throat. Ms. Johnson, you presented this information professionally, despite having been personally affected by these practices. That speaks to your character. Elaine maintained her composure. This isn't about me. It's about ensuring equal access to financial services for all qualified applicants. Would you be willing to help us understand what proper corrective action should look like? Powell asked. Elaine glanced at Michael, who gave a slight nod. While I can't provide specific recommendations during an active audit, I can point you toward industry best practices for fair lending. As the meeting concluded, several board members approached Elaine to thank her for her presentation. Walking out of the boardroom, she felt a weight lifting. What had begun as a painful rejection had transformed into an opportunity to create meaningful change, not just for herself, but for countless others who had faced the same discrimination. 6 months had passed since the Westfield financial audit concluded. On a bright spring morning, Elaine sat in her office at Regulatory Compliance Partners, now decorated with plants and family photos. Her window offered a view of Chicago's skyline, including the building where Westfield's headquarters stood. Her phone rang. It was Michael Dawson. Good news, Elaine, he said. The Federal Reserve has accepted our final report on Westfield. They're implementing all our recommendations. That's wonderful, Elaine replied, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. What about the fines? $2.3 million, plus they have to establish a $5 million fund for previously rejected qualified applicants, Michael explained. Your documentation was crucial in building such a solid case. After hanging up, Elaine opened her email to find a message from Richard Powell, Westfield's CEO. The subject line read, Thank you and update. The email detailed the changes Westfield had made since the audit, hiring a diverse lending team, establishing transparent evaluation criteria, and implementing anti-bias training for all staff. Powell also mentioned that Marcus Whitley was no longer with the bank, having resigned during the internal investigation that followed the audit. More importantly, the email included an invitation to serve on Westfield's newly formed Community Banking Advisory Board, created to ensure fair lending practices. Elaine smiled, appreciating the irony. 6 months ago, they had deemed her unworthy of a loan. Now they wanted her expertise to fix their broken system. Later that day, Elaine met with Patricia Martin, the attorney who had first gathered evidence of discrimination at Westfield. Your audit findings made our case airtight, Patricia said, stirring her coffee. The settlement will help dozens of business owners who were unfairly denied loans. Have you spoken with Jason recently? Elaine asked, thinking of Tasha's brother who had faced similar discrimination. Yes, he was one of the first to receive compensation. He's expanded his accounting firm and even hired 2 new employees. That evening, Elaine attended a community business forum in the South Side neighborhood where she had grown up. The room was packed with aspiring entrepreneurs and small business owners. We have a special guest tonight, the organizer announced. Elaine Johnson from Regulatory Compliance Partners, who recently led an audit that uncovered discriminatory lending practices at a major Chicago bank. As Elaine took the podium, she looked up at the eager faces, people who deserved the same fair shot at success that had been denied to many before them. Good evening, she began. My journey from business owner to banking auditor wasn't planned. It started with a rejection letter that didn't make sense. She shared her story, not focusing on the discrimination but on the importance of knowing your rights and standing up for them. Today, I want to share some practical advice about applying for business loans, she continued. Know the requirements, document everything, and if you're rejected, always ask for specific reasons in writing. After her presentation, many people approached her with questions. One young woman with a tech startup idea stood out. I've been afraid to apply for funding because I've heard so many rejection stories, she admitted. Elaine smiled encouragingly. Things are changing. More banks are being held accountable now. Your qualifications, not your race or gender, should determine your approval. Driving home that night, Elaine reflected on how her worst professional disappointment had led to her most meaningful work. She had never planned to become a banking auditor, and now she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The next morning, a large envelope arrived at her office. Inside was a framed certificate from the Federal Reserve Board, recognizing her outstanding contribution to ensuring fair lending practices in the banking industry. Elaine hung it on her wall, directly opposite her desk where she could see it every day, a reminder that sometimes rejection wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of a more important one.